For decades, families waited. Faces on posters, names without answers. In 2025, the silence finally broke. Some of the nation's coldest cases were solved, bringing justice after years of pain. How could it take so long? And what finally uncovered the truth? We begin with the case of Leslie Prior. Case 1. On a spring morning in May 2001, 49-year-old Leslie Prior stepped out of her Chevy Chase home for what should have been a routine run. She was the kind of woman her community cherished, a librarian who poured her heart into getting children excited about books, a mother who had raised her family with warmth and patience. That day, she never returned. When police entered her home, they found a scene of violence no one could have imagined. Leslie had been brutally beaten and strangled. A beloved mother and friend was gone, and in her place were only questions. Who could have done this, and why? The investigation began immediately. Detectives scoured the scene, lifting fingerprints, collecting DNA, and searching for witnesses. Suspicion naturally fell on those closest to Leslie, her husband, her daughter's friends, even passing acquaintances. But every lead fizzled. Even the DNA found under her fingernails, a clue that suggested a desperate fight for her life, matched no one in the databases. The years crawled forward. For Leslie's family, time stood still. Holidays were empty. Her daughter lived with the terrible burden of never knowing who had killed her mother. And for the community, the murder of such a kind, ordinary woman haunted the streets of Chevy Chase for more than 2 decades. Then, in 2024, science caught up with the evidence. Detectives turned to a powerful new tool, forensic genetic genealogy. By running that decades-old DNA through advanced genealogical databases, they began to build a family tree. And at the end of that tree was a name that stunned everyone who knew the family. Eugene Theodore Gligor. Not a stranger, not a faceless predator, but someone who had once been welcomed into their home. A boy who had dated Leslie's daughter when they were teenagers. A familiar face, hiding in plain sight all along. Investigators confirmed the match with discarded DNA, a water bottle Gligor used at an airport. The evidence was clear. After 23 years of silence, the truth finally surfaced. The man who had once been trusted by the family was the same man who had taken Leslie's life. In August 2025, Leslie's loved ones sat in a Montgomery County courtroom as Gligor pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He claimed he had been drinking, using cocaine, and suffering from blackouts on the night of the crime. But excuses did not change the reality. After more than 2 decades, he was finally held accountable. The judge sentenced him to 22 years in prison. For the Prior family, the sentence was bittersweet. Justice had arrived, but it came far too late, and it could never bring Leslie back. Her daughter, now grown, carried the unbearable truth that her own teenage boyfriend had murdered her mother. Case 2. Doris Faye Worrell. In 2006, the town of Douglas in Coffee County, Georgia, lost one of its own in the most brutal way imaginable. Doris Faye Worrell, a 42-year-old mother, was found murdered inside her home. Doris wasn't a woman who lived in the shadows. She was known for her generosity, for the way she cooked Sunday meals big enough for neighbors, for her laugh that made people turn their heads in a room. She loved her children deeply, and her entire world revolved around family. Her death sent shockwaves through the community. Investigators quickly realized this was no random act of violence. The crime scene told them Doris had been deliberately targeted. Yet even as they worked the case, chasing down leads and interviewing those close to her, the trail went cold. For nearly 2 decades, Doris's children grew up without their mother, carrying grief and unanswered questions. Every holiday, every birthday came with the same ache. Who did this, and why? The answer was far closer than anyone imagined. In 2025, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and Coffee County authorities reopened the case using modern forensic technology. Evidence collected in 2006 was re-examined with advanced DNA analysis. This time, it led them straight to someone Doris had trusted more than anyone else, her own husband, John Worrell. On May 20th, 2025, 19 years after Doris's murder, John Worrell was arrested in Missouri. He was charged with malice murder, felony murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and aggravated battery. Investigators allege that he orchestrated her killing, driven by bitter marital conflict and fear of losing custody of their children. For Doris's family, the arrest was both a relief and a wound reopened. Relief that the system had not forgotten her. Relief that her children could finally hear the truth. But also the unbearable pain of knowing the man who should have protected her was the one accused of taking her life. 19 years of silence finally broken. Case 3. Kimberly LaWanda Carter. In the summer of 1988, along the banks of the Blue River in Jackson County, Missouri, authorities made a grim discovery. Human remains, weathered by time and hidden in the woods, were found by investigators. The questions were immediate. Who was she? How did she end up here? But answers never came. No missing persons matched the remains. Dental records led nowhere. And as the years slipped by, the victim became known only as the Jackson County Jane Doe. For nearly 4 decades, she had no name, no story, and no voice. Imagine what that meant for her family. Somewhere out there, people were searching for her, waiting for a phone call, holding on to fading hope, not knowing she had already been found but remained unidentified. The cruelest fate of all, to vanish and then to be stripped even of identity. For 37 years, her case sat in evidence boxes and cold case files. She was a silent question mark in Missouri's history, a woman frozen in time. Then came 2025. Using forensic genetic genealogy, investigators re-examined the old evidence. DNA pulled from the remains was run through genealogical databases, building branches of a family tree that had been fractured for decades. Slowly, the pieces began to align, and at last, the nameless woman was given back her identity. She was Kimberly LaWanda Carter. Kimberly was only 24 years old when she vanished. She grew up in Missouri, a young black woman with a family who loved her and a life still unfolding. She was remembered as kind, spirited, and deeply connected to her community. For nearly 40 years, those who loved her had no idea what became of her. Now they finally had an answer. Kimberly was not forgotten. The case is not closed. Investigators have not yet revealed how she died or who was responsible. But by restoring her name, they gave her family something they had been denied for decades: the truth of where she was. Case 4. Marion Vanetta McWhorter. In September of 1976, a hunter trekking through the Cascades stumbled on a site that would haunt Oregon investigators for decades. Human remains, scattered, weathered by time, lay hidden in the wilderness near Swamp Mountain. The woman's death was brutal, her identity erased. Detectives tried to piece together who she was, but there were no missing person reports that matched. No fingerprints, no dental records, no family stepping forward. She was buried as the Swamp Mountain Jane Doe. For nearly 50 years, her story remained a blank space. She was a question mark in state archives, reduced to case numbers and evidence bags. For her family, somewhere out there, she was simply missing. They had no idea her body had been found. Decades dragged on. Cold case detectives revisited her file now and then, but the science of the 1970s and 80s had little to offer, and so she remained a nameless figure in Oregon's history. Then came 2025. A renewed push by the Oregon State Police, working with Othram, brought the case back into focus. They turned to forensic genetic genealogy, a tool that had already solved other decades-old mysteries. DNA was carefully extracted from the preserved remains and uploaded to genealogical databases. Slowly, through the painstaking work of building family trees, a name emerged. The Swamp Mountain Jane Doe was finally identified as Marion Vanetta Nagel McWhorter. Marion was just 21 years old when her life was cut short. She was a daughter, a sister, a woman whose family described her as lively, warm, and determined to build a better future for herself. In the mid-1970s, she had drifted west, looking for new opportunities. Instead, she vanished. For nearly 5 decades, Her family had no word, no answers, only silence. Now, in 2025, they finally know. They know where she was found. They know she was not forgotten. And they know her name, once lost to history, is back in the record. But closure is complicated. Investigators have not determined exactly how she died, or who was responsible. Her family has a name on her grave, but not yet a resolution. It is justice half delivered, a gift of truth, but not yet accountability. Case 5. Regina Roe Hicks. On April 10, 2001, in Sandusky, Ohio, a mother's life ended in violence inside the walls of her own home. Regina Roe Hicks, only 32 years old, was found murdered. Regina wasn't just a statistic in a file. She was a mother of 2 young children, known for her quick laugh, her love of gospel music, and the way she kept her family anchored despite life's struggles. She worked long hours to provide for her children and still found time to volunteer at her church. Friends remember her as the type of woman who would give away her last dollar if someone else needed it more. Her death shattered that world. Detectives launched an immediate investigation. Suspicion soon turned toward her husband, Paul Hicks. Their marriage had been rocky, marked by arguments, separations, and talk of divorce. Those closest to Regina had seen the strain. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and in 2001 the case lacked the forensic support that could carry it into court. So the case went cold. For Regina's children, the loss was unimaginable. They grew up without a mother and with a shadow hanging over their lives, whispers in the community, unanswered questions in the home. Every milestone, every birthday was marked by absence. They carried the weight of not knowing if anyone would ever be held accountable. 2 decades passed. Then, in 2025, the Ohio Attorney General's Cold Case Unit took another look at Regina's file. Evidence from the crime scene was retested using modern DNA analysis and forensic genealogy tools that didn't exist in 2001. What had once been inconclusive now painted a much clearer picture. Combined with re-examined witness statements and the timeline of events, prosecutors felt confident they finally had enough. On April 23, 2025, a Sandusky County grand jury indicted Paul Hicks for aggravated murder and kidnapping. After 24 years of suspicion, the law had caught up with him. For Regina's family, the indictment was both vindication and heartbreak. The man they had once trusted in their home, the man their children called Dad, was now accused of ending her life. It was the betrayal they had always feared, and the justice they had almost given up on. Case 6. Joanne Zamora. In the summer of 1992, Houston police were called to a grim scene in Harris County. A woman's body had been discovered, the victim of a violent homicide. She had no identification, and no one came forward to claim her. Detectives worked the case with urgency at first, combing through missing persons files, releasing sketches, hoping a family somewhere would recognize her. But as weeks turned into months, no one did. She was entered into the records as an unidentified homicide victim. For 33 years, her name was erased, her story reduced to case numbers in a cold case file. Somewhere out there, though, was her family, waiting, wondering, searching. They had no idea that their loved one had already been found. They were living in uncertainty, while in Houston's files, she sat as a Jane Doe, voiceless and unclaimed. For decades, investigators circled the same dead ends. Technology wasn't advanced enough to pull much from the DNA left at the scene. Her file joined hundreds of others in storage, brought out now and again when a detective tried one more time to match her to a missing persons report. Each time, nothing. But in 2025, the story changed. Houston's Cold Case Unit, working with forensic genealogists, reopened her file. They pulled DNA from the preserved evidence and uploaded it into genealogical databases that simply hadn't existed in the 1990s. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build a family tree. Cousins, grandparents, relatives, stretching back generations. And from those branches, the name of the woman who had been voiceless for so long emerged. She was Joanne Zamora. Joanne was a young Latina woman, just beginning to carve out her life in Houston. She was remembered by her family as lively, full of laughter, with a warmth that drew people toward her. She loved music, family gatherings, and had a stubborn determination that made her unforgettable to those who knew her best. For 33 years, her family didn't know where she was. Now they know. But closure is not the same as justice. Her identification answered who she was, but not who took her life. Investigators have not revealed a suspect, and her murder remains unsolved. For her family, the relief of finally hearing her name spoken again is shadowed by the fact that the person responsible has not yet been held to account. Still, the moment matters. After decades of silence, Joanne is no longer a Jane Doe. She is no longer lost in the files. She is remembered by her name, as she should be. Case 7. Ryan Stone. In February of 1997, deputies in Volusia County, Florida, were called to the woods near DeBary. There, beneath the shade of pines, they found the body of a young man. No wallet, no identification, no explanation, just silence. Detectives worked the scene carefully. They recorded his height, his clothing, the condition of his remains. They ran his description against every missing persons report they could find. Families across the state were contacted, each hoping, each dreading. But every comparison came back the same. No match. The case slipped into the background. For investigators, he became another John Doe. For his real family, somewhere out there, he was still missing. Two different forms of grief, separated by a single truth no one could prove. For 28 years, the mystery endured. Then, in 2025, the case was pulled from storage. The Volusia County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit partnered with forensic genealogists to re-examine the DNA collected in 1997. This time, the science was different. Using advanced genetic genealogy, analysts traced distant relatives, mapped out a family tree, and followed the branches until a single name surfaced. The John Doe from the woods was identified as Ryan Stone. Ryan had been just 22 years old when he disappeared. To his family, he was more than a case number. He was a son who loved to make people laugh, a brother who could never sit still, a young man whose life was meant to be much longer than it was. For nearly 3 decades, his family lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn, unable to move forward, because they didn't know. Now, they do. The cause of Ryan's death remains unclear, and investigators have not yet said whether foul play was involved. But what they have given his family is something they were denied for 28 years, the chance to lay him to rest by his name. Case 8. Carol Sue, Skidmore. In 1977, 35-year-old Carol Sue Skidmore disappeared during a 1977 trip to Florida. She was a mother of 4, known for her quiet strength and her devotion to her children. One day, she was simply gone. Her absence left her family fractured and her community shaken. For years, questions echoed without answers. Where was Carol? What had happened to her? 3 years later, in 1980, a hunter in rural Bay County came across a shallow grave. Inside were the skeletal remains of a woman. Detectives believed she had been the victim of foul play. They preserved what they could, clothing fragments, bones, and fragile evidence. But in that era, the science could only take them so far. The victim was buried without a name. In the files, she became another Jane Doe. For more than 4 decades, Carol's family lived with painful uncertainty. Every birthday, every holiday, they carried the absence of their mother and the gnawing possibility that she might never be found. But the story did not end there. In 2025, Bay County investigators reopened the case, working alongside specialists in forensic genetic genealogy. They carefully extracted DNA from the remains, something unimaginable in the 1980s. From that fragile sample, genealogists built out family lines, tracing distant relatives until the branches of the tree pointed back to one woman. The Jane Doe buried in Bay County was Carol Sue Skidmore. For her family, hearing her name again after nearly 50 years was both devastating and relieving. Carol was no longer lost. She was no longer a question mark in a case file. They finally knew where she was, and they could mourn her with truth rather than uncertainty. Yet closure was incomplete. Her killer has never been identified. The circumstances of her death remain unsolved. Her name is restored, but justice is still missing. Carol was more than a case. She was a daughter, a mother, and a woman who should have grown old surrounded by her family. Instead, her story became one of silence and waiting, of decades without answers. Case 9, Lynn County, Iowa, 1983. On the cold night of December 23, 1983, just 2 days before Christmas, the quiet of rural Lynn County, Iowa, was broken by violence. 24-year-old Ronald Lee Novak was found beaten to death near Walker, a small community north of Cedar Rapids. His body lay on the frozen ground. Next to him, investigators recovered a hammer believed to be the murder weapon. The brutality of the crime was shocking. Ronald was only 24, his adult life just beginning. Very little was written about him at the time. Unlike some victims whose names fill the headlines, Novak's memory was preserved mostly in police files. For his family, that silence deepened the pain. Their loved one had not only been taken, but seemed to vanish from public memory, remembered only in whispers and court numbers. Detectives in 1983 preserved what they could. They bagged Ronald's clothing. They stored the hammer. They hoped science would one day catch up. But in the early 1980s, DNA testing was almost non-existent, and without eyewitnesses or strong leads, the investigation went cold. For 41 years, the case haunted Lynn County. Ronald's parents passed away without knowing who had killed their son. His extended family grew older, carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Then, in 2025, technology finally caught up with the evidence. Investigators resubmitted the clothing and hammer for modern DNA testing and forensic genealogy. This time, scientists were able to pull out bloodstains and trace DNA strong enough to create a profile. That genetic trail led to a name: Michael S. Shapert, a 64-year-old living in Fairview, Oregon. On May 28, 2025, Lynn County deputies arrested Shapert. He waived extradition, was returned to Iowa, and formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Ronald Novak. Court filings confirm that DNA from both Novak's clothing and the hammer directly matched Shapert. Shapert has pleaded not guilty. His trial is scheduled for February 24, 2026. But here is what remains unsolved. Why? Prosecutors have not released a motive. They have not said if Ronald and Shapert knew each other, or if this was random or personal. For 4 decades, the Novak family longed for answers, and now, even with an arrest, one of the most important questions lingers in silence. Case 10, Delta County, Michigan, 1986. In the summer of 1986, a young woman set out on a bicycle trip from Lac du Flambeau, Wisconsin, to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. It was supposed to be a peaceful ride across the Upper Peninsula, a journey of freedom and endurance. But on that trip, everything changed. When she stopped to use the restroom at the Big Fish Dam River access in Garden Township, Delta County, she was ambushed. A man with a gun forced her into his vehicle, abducting her in broad daylight. He drove her to a remote area, where he sexually assaulted her before letting her go. She survived. She told police everything she could remember. Investigators collected biological evidence and documented her statement in detail. But in 1986, forensic science had limits. DNA technology existed in theory, but it wasn't a practical tool for law enforcement. With no suspect to compare the evidence against, the case went cold. For nearly 4 decades, the survivor lived with the trauma of what had been done to her, while the man who attacked her remained free. Each year reinforced a painful truth: justice seemed beyond reach. That changed in 2023, when the Michigan State Police partnered with students in Northern Michigan University's Cold Case program. The students studied the old files and made a key recommendation: use forensic investigative genetic genealogy, FIGG. The same technology now solving murders across the country. DNA from the 1986 evidence was re-examined, and genealogists built out a family tree that pointed investigators to a man who had once lived in Harris, Michigan, but later moved to Argonne, Wisconsin. By 2025, investigators had enough proof to act. On August 1, 2025, Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel announced that the Delta County Prosecutor's Office had authorized charges of kidnapping and first-degree criminal sexual conduct against the identified suspect, a man who was 78 years old at the time. But before deputies could make the arrest, the story took a final turn. On July 27, 2025, just 2 days before his scheduled arrest, the suspect was found dead at his Wisconsin home. The Michigan State Police confirmed the charges would still be entered into the record, even though there would never be a trial. His name, however, has not been made public because he died before being arraigned. For the survivor, this resolution came late, but it came. After 39 years, she was finally given the truth, who had attacked her, and how investigators proved it. She will never see him convicted in a courtroom, but she no longer has to live with uncertainty. Case 11, Saginaw, Michigan, 2003. On February 22, 2003, police in Saginaw, Michigan were called to the banks of the Flint River, just steps from the home of 57-year-old Jeanette Wilton. What they found was horrifying. Jeanette's body had been pulled from the water. At first glance, it might have looked like an accident. But the autopsy told a different story. She had been strangled and stabbed multiple times in the neck. Her body showed blunt force trauma to the head and face, bruises across her body, and post-mortem abrasions from being dragged. There was no question. This was homicide. Jeanette was more than a name in a file. She had spent her career as a hospital worker, caring for others. She was a mother to 3 sons, and her family described her as the kind of woman who anchored them, someone whose absence would leave a hole that could never be filled. But almost immediately, her case stalled. In 2003, forensic tools were far less advanced. DNA analysis was still in its early stages, and investigators couldn't develop a profile strong enough to identify a suspect. The leads went nowhere, and the case went cold. For her sons, the decades that followed were filled with birthdays, holidays, and milestones, all haunted by absence and unanswered questions. Then, nearly 2 decades later, the case was reopened. In 2021, the Michigan State Police 3rd District Cold Case Team partnered with Western Michigan University's Cold Case Program, the MSP Forensic Lab, and a private laboratory funded through a cold case grant. They carefully re-examined the evidence that had been preserved since 2003. Modern DNA testing and advanced investigative techniques provided something earlier generations of detectives could not: a genetic profile strong enough to point to a suspect. The name was Jason Cabello. Investigators determined that Cabello had once lived in the area and had previously been in a relationship with one of Jeanette's relatives. With new forensic evidence in hand, the Michigan State Police submitted the case to the Attorney General in September 2024 for review. On August 1, 2025, Attorney General Dana Nessel announced that Cabello, now 47, would stand trial for Jeanette's murder. He was formally charged with first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, and first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and was bound over to Saginaw County's 10th Circuit Court. Cabello has pleaded not guilty, and as of now, a trial date has not been set. For Jeanette's family, the announcement was bittersweet. After 22 years, her case is no longer just a file in a drawer. The woman they lost has not been forgotten. But the path to justice is still unfinished, and the trial ahead will determine whether the man accused of killing her will finally be held accountable. Case 12, Union City, California, 2009. On a spring morning in May 2009, a worker taking out trash at the Parkside Apartments in Union City, California, made a discovery that would haunt an entire community. Inside a dumpster, wrapped and discarded, lay the body of a newborn baby girl. The medical examiner would later determine she had been alive when she was placed there. The cause of death was drowning. She had been gone for less than 24 hours. For residents, it was almost unthinkable. A child's first day of life should have been marked by warmth, safety, and hope. Instead, her first and last hours ended in abandonment. Police and neighbors alike were shaken. Who was she? And who could have done this? Without a name to give her, Union City detectives and local advocates gave her one: Matea Esperanza. In Hebrew and Spanish, it meant gift from God, hope. It was a way to restore her humanity, to say that she mattered even if her beginning had been stolen from her. Detectives pursued every lead. They collected forensic samples from the child. They searched hospital records for recent births. They combed through witness statements. Yet nothing led them to the truth. The DNA they had wasn't strong enough to match anyone in existing databases. For years, her case remained unsolved. A Jane Doe baby, with a name chosen by strangers, but no justice. Time moved on, but the case wasn't forgotten. In 2023, the Union City Police Department made a bold move. They partnered with Othram, a forensic lab specializing in advanced DNA extraction and genealogical analysis. Scientists re-examined the degraded evidence, pulling a full profile from Matea's remains. From there, they worked backwards, mapping relatives, building out family trees, looking for the one branch that would answer the question left open since 2009. In 2025, the search narrowed to a woman in Denver, Colorado, Angela Beth Ondudo, 46 years old. Detectives followed the lead, collecting confirmatory DNA. The results left no doubt. Angela Ondudo was the biological mother of the baby left in the Union City dumpster 16 years earlier. In May 2025, Union City detectives traveled to Denver. They arrested Ondudo and booked her into custody. Soon after, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office filed a murder charge under California Penal Code 187. She now awaits extradition to face trial in California. For the Union City Police Department, it was the culmination of 16 years of persistence. For the community, it was a measure of long-awaited justice for a baby who had been nameless and voiceless for too long. Case 13, Longview, Texas, 1998. In the early summer of 1998, tragedy struck a quiet corner of Gregg County, Texas. On June 15th, deputies were called to a field near the intersection of Harrison Road and Jordan Valley Road, just outside Longview. There, they discovered the body of a newborn baby girl. She had been full term. An autopsy later confirmed what detectives feared. The infant had been born alive, but her life ended almost immediately. The cause of death was ruled homicide. Investigators had little to work with. The baby had no name. No one came forward to claim her. She became known in the records simply as Baby Jane Doe. For law enforcement, it was one of the most heartbreaking cases imaginable. Detectives scoured local hospitals for records of recent births. They interviewed residents near the field, hoping someone had seen or heard something. They collected biological evidence and preserved it carefully. But in 1998, DNA science was far too limited to provide answers. For the Gregg County Sheriff's Office, the case became a wound that never closed. Every detective who reviewed the file felt the weight of a baby girl discarded in a field, her story unfinished. Years turned into decades. Baby Jane Doe's file sat in storage, marked as cold, but never forgotten. Then came 2023, and with it, a tool investigators of the 1990s never had: forensic genetic genealogy. The Gregg County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram Inc., a Texas-based laboratory that specializes in recovering DNA from even the most degraded samples. Scientists were able to build a complete genetic profile from the preserved evidence. Through genealogical databases and painstaking tree building, investigators followed the branches until they reached a name. In 2025, after 27 years of silence, that name led them to Misty Marie Mitchell, a 46-year-old woman living in Longview. Detectives secured a court order to obtain Mitchell's DNA directly. When the results came back, the conclusion was inescapable. She was the biological mother of baby Jane Doe. On September 10, 2025, Gregg County authorities arrested Misty Marie Mitchell and charged her with capital murder. She is being held in the Gregg County Jail, her bond set at $750,000. The sheriff emphasized that the case is still under investigation, but after nearly 3 decades, the community finally knows who the mother was. For residents of Longview, the arrest was both shocking and sobering. The woman accused had lived among them for years. For law enforcement, it was the end of one chapter in a case that had haunted them for more than 2 decades. Case 14, Toronto, Canada, 1998. On the cold morning of March 8, 1998, police were called to a rear parking lot at 130 Carlton Street, just east of downtown Toronto. There, lying lifeless on the ground, was a young woman. She was 24 years old, 4 months pregnant, and far from home. Her name was Donna Ogilvie. Donna's story began thousands of miles away. Born in the Philippines, she grew up in British Columbia. Those who knew her described her as bright, spirited, and determined to find her own way in the world. In early 1998, she came to Toronto, hoping for a fresh start. But instead of opportunity, she met tragedy. The autopsy confirmed she had been strangled. The attack had not only taken her life, but also the life of her unborn child. For investigators, it was a double loss. One young woman, and the future she carried, gone in a single act of violence. From the start, Toronto police treated the case with urgency. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed residents, and combed through the evidence. At the scene, they recovered biological material that allowed them to build a male DNA profile. But in 1998, that wasn't enough. The DNA did not match anyone in Canada's databases, and with no clear suspect, the case went cold. For Donna's family back in British Columbia, the news was devastating. They were left to grieve not only the daughter and sister they had lost, but also the unborn grandchild, niece, or nephew they would never meet. Each year that passed without answers deepened the wound. For the Toronto police, the case lingered like a shadow. Detectives knew they had critical evidence, but without technology to push it further, Donna's files sat in the cold case archives. Everything changed in 2025. The Toronto Police Service Cold Case Unit reopened Donna's file and partnered with Othram, a forensic lab specializing in genetic genealogy. Using the DNA left at the crime scene, scientists built a family tree from distant relatives found in genealogical databases. It was a painstaking process, connecting fragments of the past with the present. That tree led to a name: Ronald Gordon Ackerman, a 50-year-old man from Gander, Newfoundland. Police tracked him carefully. When Ackerman flew into Toronto Pearson International Airport on February 6, 2025, detectives were waiting. After 26 years, the man they believed had strangled Donna and her unborn child was placed in handcuffs. Ackerman has been charged with first-degree murder in Donna Ogilvie's death. He is now in custody, awaiting trial. For Donna's family, the arrest brings long-awaited vindication, but also new grief. The man accused of killing her had lived free for more than 2 decades, while they carried the weight of unanswered questions. Justice has finally begun to move, but it can never return what was lost. Donna, her dreams, and the life she carried inside her. Case 15, Montreal, Canada, 2008. On the evening of December 11, 2008, firefighters responded to a blaze inside an apartment on 5th Avenue near Masson Street in Montreal's Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie neighborhood. At first, it seemed like a routine call, a small apartment fire, smoke curling out into the winter air. But when the flames were extinguished, a far darker truth came into view. Inside the apartment, first responders discovered the body of 26-year-old Catherine Daviau. She had been murdered. And the fire? Investigators quickly determined it was no accident. It had been set deliberately, an attempt to destroy evidence and erase the crime. Catherine's murder stunned the community. She was just 26, young and full of promise, with a career and a future ahead of her. Her family and friends were left devastated, struggling to understand how someone could take her life so violently, and then try to burn away every trace of it. Montreal Police, the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, SPVM, launched a massive investigation. Detectives worked around the clock, analyzing the scene, collecting biological samples, interviewing neighbors and acquaintances. They recovered a DNA profile from the evidence, a vital clue. But in 2008, the profile led nowhere. No match in Quebec's databases, no suspect to pursue. For Catherine's family, the years that followed were unbearable. Holidays, birthdays, and ordinary days alike carried the same emptiness, the absence of answers. Who had done this? And why? The case sat cold for nearly 17 years. Then came 2025. By now, forensic science had advanced in ways investigators could only dream of in 2008. The SPVM, working with Quebec's Laboratoire de Sciences Judiciaires et de Médecine Légale, turned to forensic genetic genealogy. They re-examined the old DNA, this time cross-referencing it with genealogical databases, building family trees, and tracing distant relatives. At last, the pieces began to align. The DNA led to a name: Jacques Bolduc. Bolduc was no stranger to violence. He had a criminal record for armed robberies and attempted murders. But there was one problem. Bolduc was already dead. He had died in 2021 while serving his sentence for unrelated crimes. The revelation closed the case but left a bittersweet outcome. Catherine's family now knew who had taken her life. They had a name, a face, and confirmation after nearly 2 decades of uncertainty. But because Bolduc was gone, there would be no trial, no chance for her loved ones to look him in the eye, and no possibility of formal justice. For investigators, it was a breakthrough that reaffirmed the power of modern science. For Catherine's family, it was an answer that came far too late. Case 16, Oakland, California, 2003. In September 2003, a call came in to the Alameda County Sheriff's Office. Under the Coast Guard Island Bridge, near the 1800 block of Denison Street in Oakland, skeletal remains had been found floating in the water. The discovery was grim, but also mysterious. Who was this person? What had happened to them? Investigators recovered the remains and carefully collected what little evidence time had left behind. Alongside the bones, they found clothing: a blue denim jacket, a red pullover shirt, a checkered button-down, denim pants, running shoes, and socks. From the start, detectives knew they were dealing with a man. But beyond that, the trail ended. No wallet, no ID, no missing persons report that matched. The man became another number in the system, listed in 2017 in Namus, case UP16539, as Oakland John Doe. For years, his body sat in the coroner's records, his name and story erased by time. For investigators, the lack of identity was a roadblock. Without a name, there was no way to notify family, no way to build a picture of how he had ended up beneath that bridge. For his loved ones, wherever they were, he was just missing, a gap in their lives they could not explain. The case stayed cold for over 2 decades. Then came 2024, and with it, technology that could finally push beyond the limits of the early 2000s. The Alameda County Sheriff Coroner's Office, working with the California Department of Justice Missing Persons DNA program, turned to Othram Inc., a laboratory specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. Othram scientists carefully extracted DNA from the degraded remains and ran it through forensic-grade genome sequencing. They uploaded the resulting profile into genealogical databases, building family trees, tracing distant relatives, and slowly working their way back to one identity. In 2025, after more than 21 years of silence, they found their answer. The man beneath the bridge was identified as Robert Craig Whitsett, known to friends and family simply as Craig. Craig had been born in New York. He was more than bones and case numbers. He was a man with a story, a name, and people who had once cared for him. After decades of not knowing, his relatives were finally given closure. For the Alameda County Sheriff's Office, it was a breakthrough that underscored the importance of persistence and science. For Craig's family, it was bittersweet. The relief of finally knowing where he was after so many years was paired with the pain of what had been lost. Decades of unanswered questions, and the chance to know what really happened to him. Case 17, Claremont, Florida, 1988. On September 25, 1988, in a remote wooded stretch of Claremont, Florida, a hiker stumbled on a discovery that would haunt Lake County investigators for decades. Hidden off County Road 474, skeletal remains lay scattered beneath the trees. The body bore no identification. There was no wallet, no driver's license, no clue to immediately connect these bones to a missing persons file. Investigators carefully logged what they found: bones, fragments of clothing, and most strikingly, evidence of surgical implants. In the late 1980s, this detail startled detectives. The remains were anatomically male, but breast implants suggested the victim had been in the process of transitioning. At the time, Law enforcement had little cultural understanding and even fewer forensic tools to work with. Their reports listed the victim as male, but the evidence told a more complex story. The case was entered into records as an unidentified homicide victim. Without a name, detectives could not tell her story. For years, the remains were known only by a placeholder, Julie Doe. Forensic artists produced reconstructions of her face, trying to give her back some presence. Advocacy groups in later years, especially those focused on missing LGBTQ+ individuals, kept her memory alive. But despite their work, for nearly 4 decades, she remained nameless. Every year that passed deepened the tragedy. Somewhere, a family wondered why their loved one never came home. Somewhere, her truth was left unspoken. Then came the 2020s, and with them, science powerful enough to challenge the silence. The Lake County Sheriff's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit dedicated to using genetic genealogy to identify Jane and John Does. Technicians carefully extracted DNA from Pamela's decades-old remains. The sample was fragile, degraded by time and exposure, but new sequencing technology could build a profile where old methods had failed. That DNA was uploaded into genealogical databases. From there, researchers began painstakingly tracing family trees, moving from distant cousins to closer relatives, following the branches back to a single identity. On March 10, 2025, after 36 years of waiting, the truth was revealed. Julie Doe was in fact Pamela Lee Walton. Pamela was born on May 13, 1963, in Kentucky. She was later adopted and grew up in Tennessee, one of several siblings in a large family. Records show that she had been living her life as a transgender woman at a time when support and safety were scarce. By the late 1980s, she was in Florida, seeking to carve out her future. Instead, her life ended violently, her remains left in the woods, her identity erased for decades. For her family, the identification was bittersweet. They finally knew where Pamela was, and they could speak her name again after nearly 40 years of uncertainty. But with that answer came sorrow, the realization of how long she had been gone, and how she had died alone without justice. Detectives have not determined Pamela's exact cause of death, but the circumstances make foul play highly likely. The homicide investigation remains open, with authorities appealing for information from anyone who might remember her. Pamela's case carries a unique weight. It is not just about solving a murder. It is about restoring dignity to a woman whose life and truth were erased, first by her killer, and then by decades of silence. Case 18, Cotulla, Texas, 2005. In 2005, the small town of Cotulla, Texas, located along the long stretch of I-35 in LaSalle County, carried a secret it couldn't solve. Somewhere in the heat of that summer, a life had been taken, brutally, deliberately, and a family was left without answers. The crime shocked investigators from the start. Evidence was collected, remains were preserved, and law enforcement did what they could with the tools available at the time. But in 2005, forensic science was far more limited. DNA analysis could confirm profiles, but it couldn't trace family lines. Genealogy as an investigative tool didn't exist yet. With no suspect and no clear trail to follow, the file slipped into the cold case archives. For nearly 2 decades, the story lay dormant, a painful silence for the victim's family, and a reminder to Cotulla that some wounds never heal. But cold cases don't disappear. They wait. And in Texas, the waiting ended in 2025. The LaSalle County Sheriff's Office, working with the Texas Rangers, the Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, and the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, reopened the case. They turned to modern DNA technology, the kind that could pull a genetic profile from evidence degraded by time and circumstance. It worked. The DNA, once silent, now spoke. Investigators used the profile to build connections, confirm suspicions, and follow the path toward a suspect who had eluded justice for 2 decades. On August 29, 2025, a LaSalle County grand jury indicted a 66-year-old man from San Antonio for capital murder in connection with the Cotulla case. For the victim's family, whose name has not yet been released publicly, the announcement carried both relief and pain. Relief that law enforcement had not given up, that the crime had not been forgotten, that someone would finally face the weight of accountability. Pain that it had taken 20 years, that so much life had passed without justice, and that their loved one had been denied the protection of the law for so long. For Cotulla itself, the indictment was a reminder that even in small towns where everybody knows everybody, secrets can hide in plain sight, and that sometimes it takes decades, and science unthinkable in 2005, to bring the truth to the surface. The accused will stand trial facing the most serious charge Texas can bring. Whether convicted or not, the progress marks a turning point. The case is no longer silent, no longer forgotten. Case 19, Demon Taylor, 2008, St. Louis, Missouri. On the evening of June 20th, 2008, St. Louis, Missouri, lost one of its own protectors in a crime that would take 17 long years to resolve. Demon Taylor was not just another name in a police file. At 36 years old, he was an off-duty campus police officer working at St. Louis Community College, Florissant Valley. Colleagues remembered him as dedicated and disciplined, a man who cared deeply about keeping students safe. To his family, he was much more: a son, a friend, a figure of stability, and someone who embodied service. That summer evening, Demon was sitting at a red light in his car on the 5100 block of Page Boulevard. It should have been a routine pause in traffic. Instead, it became the last moment of his life. A gunman walked up and opened fire, killing him instantly. In an instant, his future was stolen, his community shaken, and his family left shattered. Investigators with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department immediately launched into action. The murder of a police officer, even off-duty, carries a weight of urgency. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed potential witnesses, and recovered ballistic evidence. But despite their best efforts, no suspect was identified. The city mourned while the file went cold. For years, the case lingered in silence. Every anniversary brought reminders. Family and friends gathered at vigils, refusing to let Demon's name fade from memory. His colleagues at the college police department wore the grief of knowing their friend had been killed on the very streets he swore to protect. But in 2008, investigative tools were limited. DNA testing was narrow, forensic genealogy was still years away, and witnesses often hesitated to step forward. Without clear leads, the trail ran dry. Still, the file remained open. Detectives held on to the hope that time and science might someday catch up. And in 2025, it finally did. The breakthrough. In August 2025, after nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions, prosecutors announced a stunning development. Brandon Levy, now 46 years old, had been arrested and charged with first-degree murder for the killing of Officer Demon Taylor. The breakthrough did not come from DNA or new forensic testing. Instead, it came from witnesses who, after years of silence, finally spoke up. At least 3 individuals identified Levy as the shooter, placing him at the scene and naming him as the man who pulled the trigger. Detectives pieced together the new accounts, supported by the original case evidence. What emerged was a chilling conclusion. Demon Taylor had been killed in a case of mistaken identity. Investigators believe Levy had targeted him under the false assumption that Taylor was a rival gang member. That revelation compounded the tragedy. Not only had Demon been taken violently from his loved ones, he had been killed for nothing, for a mistake, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The arrest. On August 23, 2025, St. Louis police announced Levy's arrest. The city that had lived under the shadow of this cold case for so long finally saw a measure of accountability. For Demon's family, the news reopened wounds, but also delivered long-delayed hope. Justice was now within reach. Court documents confirmed that Levy had been only 29 years old at the time of the killing. For 17 years, while Taylor's family grieved, Levy lived free. Now the system was catching up. Levy was booked into custody and charged with first-degree murder. Initially held without bond, a judge later set conditions for his release while awaiting trial, a decision that sparked debate across St. Louis. For prosecutors, the case is clear. The evidence and testimony point to Levy as the man who killed an officer in cold blood. For the defense, the coming trial will test those claims. The weight of 17 years. For the Taylor family, the years between 2008 and 2025 were defined by silence and waiting. Birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days all carried the same heavy absence. Every time his name came up, there was pain. Every time a headline about another cold case appeared, they wondered, when will it be Demon's turn? Now, after nearly 2 decades, there is finally movement. A courtroom will hear the evidence. A jury will weigh the facts. And for the first time since 2008, the family can hope for accountability. But the reality remains harsh. No verdict, no sentence can restore what was lost. Case 20, Michael Sidney Hill, UK citizen identified in Arizona, 2013 to 2025. In February 2013, a quiet home in Maricopa County, Arizona, became the scene of one of the most unusual cold cases in modern history. A man, elderly, frail, and clearly unwell, entered a friend's home. He had no identification on him. Hours later, he collapsed, convulsed, and died. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office was tasked with the routine but crucial responsibility: identify the deceased and notify the next of kin. At first, this seemed straightforward. The friend told investigators his name, Michael Sidney Hill. He even provided a date of birth. But when officials tried to verify that information, they hit a wall. No passport, no driver's license, no bank cards, not even dental records that matched. For years, he existed only in files as 2013 Maricopa County John Doe. A life paused in silence. Michael Hill had not died in obscurity. He was a British citizen, born in the United Kingdom, who had traveled to the United States to visit. Yet in death, his identity dissolved into paperwork, uncertainty, and silence. Imagine the human cost. A man with a name, a history, and a homeland. Yet in the official records, he became a nameless body. His relatives back in the UK had no idea what had happened to him. For them, he was simply missing from their lives, without explanation. For American authorities, the case was equally frustrating. They had fragments of information, but nothing that could be verified. Fingerprints led nowhere. No missing persons report matched. Traditional identification methods stalled, and so Michael's story drifted into the background of Maricopa County's hundreds of cold case files. The IgG revolution. Fast forward to the 2020s. A new technology began rewriting cold case history. Investigative genetic genealogy, IgG. This was not science fiction. It was the marriage of forensic DNA and genealogical databases, tools that could trace bloodlines across continents. By 2025, IgG had already been responsible for solving dozens of cases in the US. But for Michael Hill, it represented something even bigger: the first transatlantic cold case identification of its kind. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with experts at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK, Silverwell Research in London, and Ramapo College of New Jersey. Together, they launched an unprecedented cross-border investigation. Researchers carefully extracted DNA from Michael's remains and uploaded the profile into genealogical systems. The search began not in Arizona, but across the Atlantic, where British relatives might hold the missing pieces. The breakthrough. The process was painstaking. Genealogists built family trees, traced cousin lines, and cross-checked with UK public records. At last, they reached a pivotal moment. In May 2025, 2 of Michael's first cousins once removed in Britain agreed to provide DNA samples. Those samples confirmed the link. The science was clear. On June 24, 2025, the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office announced what had eluded them for more than 12 years. The man found in Arizona in 2013 was Michael Sidney Hill, aged 75. The news traveled quickly across both sides of the Atlantic. It was more than just an identification. It was history. The first British citizen ever identified in the United States through investigative genetic genealogy. For Michael's relatives, the confirmation was bittersweet. On one hand, They finally had closure after more than a decade of silence. They could speak his name again with certainty, no longer haunted by the unknown. On the other, the realization was painful. He had died far from home, with no family by his side, and it had taken 12 years for the truth to reach them. For investigators, the identification marked a triumph of persistence and technology. What once seemed like an impossible case, an elderly man with no ID in a foreign land, was solved through international cooperation, cutting-edge science, and the willingness of family members to step forward. Case 21. Eric Ricky Singer. In the spring of 1973, the Singer family home in Cleveland, Ohio, was filled with the ordinary sounds of life. Eric Singer, known to everyone as Ricky, was just 22 years old, caught in that tender space between youth and adulthood. He was restless, adventurous, and searching for something more. Ricky had always been curious, the kind of young man who wanted to see the world instead of just reading about it. And in 1973 he set out for Canada, telling his family he would return. He never did. When Ricky vanished, his family's world collapsed into uncertainty. His parents waited by the phone for news that never came. His sisters, Ruth and Mary, grew up with an emptiness that shaped their lives. For decades, all they could say was that their brother left for Canada and was never seen again. 7 years after his disappearance, in 1980, a hiker wandered off a marked trail in Algonquin Provincial Park, Ontario, and stumbled on something chilling: human remains scattered beneath the trees. Beside them lay Ricky's belongings: a leather wallet, a single boot, a sleeping bag, and fragments of clothing that had weathered years of exposure. To investigators in Ontario, this was an unsolved mystery, but not yet a solved name. They did what they could with the tools of the time. Dental comparisons were attempted, skeletal analysis conducted, but nothing matched. There was no missing person on record that fit the remains. So the case went cold. Years passed. In 1995, a partial jawbone from the remains was recovered and preserved. A forensic facial reconstruction was attempted in 2017 and circulated in Canadian missing persons files. But even then, no one came forward to claim him. The man remained nameless, a John Doe deep in the records of Algonquin Park. For Ricky's family back in Ohio, silence grew heavier with every year. His parents passed away without knowing the truth. Ruth and Mary carried their brother's absence into adulthood, always wondering if they would ever learn what became of him. Everything changed in the 2020s. Advances in investigative genetic genealogy gave investigators tools that hadn't existed when Ricky disappeared. In 2022, the Ontario Provincial Police submitted Ricky's preserved DNA to genealogical databases. By 2023, they had a presumptive match to family members in the United States. The detectives reached out to Ricky's sisters. Ruth and Mary provided their DNA, and for the first time in 5 decades, the pieces aligned. On February 14, 2025, the Ontario Provincial Police announced what the Singer family had always feared, and yet always needed to hear. The remains found in Algonquin Park in 1980 belonged to Eric Ricky Singer. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication of murder or violence. Investigators believe Ricky likely died of exposure or accident while traveling alone through the park, his journey ending in silence beneath the Canadian pines. For Ruth and Mary, the confirmation was both devastating and healing. After more than half a century, they could finally stop searching. They could say his name aloud, place him in memory not as missing, but as their brother who once lived, loved, and dreamed. Eric Ricky Singer was more than a file in Ontario. He was a young man who carried the restless spirit of the 1970s, a son who left home in search of something greater, and a brother who was deeply loved. His story speaks not only to the power of modern science, but to the endurance of family, a family that never stopped holding space for him, even when the world had forgotten. In the end, Ricky's remains were returned to Ohio, so he could finally rest where his story began. His name is no longer lost in the files of Algonquin Park. After 50 years of silence, Ricky Singer was found. Case 22. Bear Brook, the final identification. In the history of American cold cases, few are as haunting as the Bear Brook murders of Allenstown, New Hampshire. For nearly 40 years, investigators carried the weight of 4 unidentified victims. 2 barrels hidden deep in the woods of Bear Brook State Park. 2 separate discoveries years apart. It was a mystery that defied resolution, a case that became a symbol of both forensic frustration and the relentless hope that science could one day deliver answers. In September 2025, the final silence broke. The last unidentified child, the one long known as the middle child, was given her name back. She was Rhea Rasmussen, born in 1976, the biological daughter of the very man who had orchestrated the murders, serial predator Terry Pater Rasmussen. The discovery in the woods. It began in November 1985, when a hunter stumbled upon a rusted metal barrel in Bear Brook State Park. Inside were the dismembered remains of a woman and a young girl. Investigators were shaken, not only by the brutality of the crime, but by the complete absence of identity. Who were they? How had they ended up in a barrel in a New Hampshire forest? The trail quickly ran cold. Then, in 2000, 15 years later, a second barrel was discovered only a few hundred feet from the first. Inside were the remains of 2 more young girls. Together, the 4 victims told a story of horrific violence, but without names, their voices could not be fully heard. The first breakthrough. For decades, these 4 souls were known only as Jane Does. It wasn't until 2017, when the advent of forensic genetic genealogy arrived, that cracks finally appeared in the wall of silence. By tracing DNA through family trees, investigators identified 3 of the victims in 2019. Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, a young mother from California. Her 2 daughters, Marie Vaughn, born 1971, and Sarah McWaters, born 1978. The revelation tied the case to Terry Rasmussen, a drifter whose trail of violence stretched across the United States. Rasmussen, known under multiple aliases, Robert Evans, Larry Vanner, had already been linked to the disappearance of another child, Lisa Jensen, and was suspected in several other unsolved cases. By then, Rasmussen was long dead, having died in a California prison in 2010 while serving a sentence for murder. But one mystery remained. The 4th victim, the middle child, was not related to Marlise Honeychurch or her daughters. She was different. Investigators knew only that her DNA showed a biological link to Rasmussen himself. For years, she remained the missing piece. The breakthrough in 2025. In September 2025, that missing piece finally fell into place. The New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit, working alongside the DNA Doe Project, confirmed that the middle child was Rhea Rasmussen. Rhea was born in 1976 in Orange County, California, the daughter of Rasmussen and Pepper Reed, a woman from Texas. Records indicate that Rhea was around 2 to 4 years old when she died, placing her death in the late 1970s or very early 1980s during Rasmussen's years of movement across California and the Northeast. Her identification was confirmed using DNA analysis and genealogical research, mapping connections across the United States and Canada, until the family tree pointed with certainty to her. A family's questions. For decades, the Rasmussen family, spread across different states, carried unanswered questions about a child they barely knew had existed. The confirmation in 2025 gave them what investigators call the gift of truth, but it came with devastating weight. Rhea's mother, Pepper Reed, remains missing. Authorities believe she may also have been killed by Rasmussen, though her remains have never been located. With Rhea's identification, investigators now hope renewed attention may lead to information about Pepper's fate. The Bear Brook case has become a landmark in American criminal justice, not only for its brutality, but also for its impact on forensic science. It was one of the first major cases to prove the power of forensic genetic genealogy. The identification of Marlise Honeychurch and her daughters in 2019, and finally Rhea in 2025, has reshaped how investigators approach long unsolved cases. But the story is also a chilling reminder of how long one man's violence can echo. Terry Rasmussen died in prison without ever facing trial for Bear Brook. He lived free for decades, moving between states, using aliases, and leaving behind victims. His crimes destroyed families in both the US and Canada, and even today, investigators believe there may be other victims connected to him. When the news broke in September 2025, investigators and families stood side by side at a press conference. They spoke not of victory, but of resolution, of the bittersweet relief of speaking Rea's name aloud after nearly 4 decades. Detectives reminded the public that although Rasmussen is gone, the case remains open in certain respects. The questions of Pepper Reed's fate and the possibility of other victims are still unresolved. For Rea's surviving family, the identification was a moment of clarity and of heartbreak. They can now grieve with truth, but they must also accept that justice, in the traditional sense, will never come. The identification of Rea Rasmussen closes one of the longest-standing mysteries in American true crime history. It restores dignity to a little girl whose identity was erased for nearly 40 years, and it underscores how science, persistence, and the refusal to forget can finally overcome decades of silence. Case 23. Maud Holden, Portland, Maine, 1994. On a September night in 1994, the city of Portland, Maine, lost one of its quiet treasures. Her name was Maud Holden, 73 years old, a retired woman known in her neighborhood for her warmth, her independence, and the way she could turn even the smallest interaction into kindness. She lived in an apartment along Washington Avenue, in a building where residents looked out for one another. But on that night, a sudden fire engulfed her unit. When firefighters arrived, smoke and flames were already pushing through the windows. Inside, they discovered Maud's body. At first, the thought was tragic but simple. Perhaps an accident, the kind of fire that sometimes claims elderly lives. But when the scene was examined more closely, investigators reached a darker conclusion. This was no accident. It was arson. Maud had died of smoke inhalation, but the fire itself had been deliberately set. Someone had murdered a 73-year-old woman in her own home. The investigation. From the beginning, detectives faced challenges. In 1994, fire scenes were notoriously difficult to process. Evidence is often destroyed by the very flames investigators are trying to understand. Still, Portland police collected what they could: witness accounts from neighbors, trace evidence from the apartment, and the knowledge that someone had poured accelerant and sparked a deadly blaze. They interviewed residents, canvassed the area, and questioned potential suspects. Among those interviewed was Vicky, sometimes reported as Vicky McMahon, a woman who lived in Portland and was known to police. But in the mid-1990s, the information they had was not enough. No charges were filed, and the case grew cold. For Maud's family, it was agony. They had lost a loved one, and year after year, the truth remained hidden. Every birthday, every holiday, was marked not just by her absence, but by the knowledge that her killer still walked free. Decades of silence. As time passed, the case faded from headlines but not from memory. Detectives revisited it over the years, pulling the file, reviewing the original witness statements, hoping technology or testimony would one day shift the balance. But the 1990s turned into the 2000s, then the 2010s. Maud's name lingered in the Portland Police Department's cold case files, one of many unsolved murders haunting the city. For nearly 3 decades, her story remained unfinished. The breakthrough in 2025. In September 2025, Portland police made an announcement that shocked the community. After 31 years, the case of Maud Holden was officially closed. What had changed? According to investigators, new witness testimony finally broke the silence. People who had remained quiet for decades came forward, or were re-interviewed, and their statements provided the missing link. Those accounts, combined with the original evidence, pointed to the person investigators had suspected all along: Vicky McMahon. McMahon had been identified as the suspect in the arson murder of Maud Holden. But the case carried a bittersweet turn. She had died in 2023. There would be no trial, no courtroom confrontation, no prison sentence. Still, Portland Police Chief Mark Dubois emphasized that closure was important. Even if justice in the legal sense could not be carried out, the truth had been revealed. The silence had finally ended. The resolution. For the Holden family, the announcement was both relief and heartbreak. Relief that their mother and grandmother had not been forgotten, that police had never abandoned the search for answers. Heartbreak that the suspect would never face a jury, never stand in court to answer for what had been done. For the city of Portland, it was a reminder that even cold cases decades old can find resolution, not just through science, but through persistence, memory, and the courage of witnesses who decide at last to speak. Maud Holden's name now moves from the list of unsolved mysteries to the record of solved crimes. She is no longer simply the victim of an unexplained fire. She is remembered as a woman whose life mattered, whose death was not forgotten, and whose story has finally been given its ending. Case 24, Vivian Moss, Santa Clara County, California, 1981. In the summer of 1981, San Jose, California was a city in transition. Technology was beginning to shape the region, but the neighborhood still carried the feel of old Santa Clara County, quiet, suburban, and seemingly safe. On the morning of July 11th, 1981, that sense of safety was shattered. In a barren field near what is now the VTA Berryessa Transit Center, workers stumbled upon a scene that would disturb detectives for decades. Lying in the dirt was a torso, dismembered, mutilated, and showing signs of multiple stab wounds to the chest. It was an act of staggering violence. Beside the body were two small items: religious pendants, one depicting Christian imagery, the other tied to spiritual symbolism. They were the only clues, and even they offered little clarity. Who was she? Why was she left here? The Santa Clara County Coroner's Office cataloged the remains, and investigators opened a homicide file. But almost immediately, they hit a wall. There was no missing persons report that matched the body. Dental comparisons led nowhere. Fingerprints were impossible to recover. The woman, clearly someone's daughter, friend, or mother, had been stripped not only of her life, but of her name. For detectives, the brutality suggested rage or intimacy. This wasn't the work of a detached killer, but someone who wanted to erase her completely. The dismemberment made identification nearly impossible in 1981, and without her name, the homicide investigation stalled before it truly began. She was recorded simply as an unidentified homicide victim, buried under case numbers and silence. For years, the file sat untouched. Detectives revisited it occasionally, pulling the photographs, reviewing the pendants, wondering if a new lead might surface. None ever did. For the public, her story faded into the background. For her family, somewhere in another city, another state, perhaps another country, they lived with a different kind of anguish. They knew someone they loved had vanished, but they did not know she had been found, already murdered, already buried without her name. Decades passed. San Jose transformed into the capital of Silicon Valley, but this field of bones remained an open wound. In the 2000s, as DNA technology became more powerful, investigators attempted new tests. But degradation from heat and time meant the results were partial at best. The pendants were cataloged again, their mystery deepened rather than solved. It wasn't until 2023 that the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit made a bold decision to submit the DNA for forensic genetic genealogy. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a lab that had already helped solve other decades-old mysteries. Technicians painstakingly extracted fragments of DNA from the preserved remains. From there, genealogists began the long process of tree building: distant cousins, great-grandparents, fractured branches that stretched across the U.S. Piece by piece, the lines converged. Then came the final decisive comparison, with DNA provided by a granddaughter who had wondered about the missing link in her family tree. The match was undeniable. In July 2025, after 44 years, the name was restored: Vivian Moss, age 54 at the time of her death. Vivian wasn't a stranger with no ties. She had roots, community, and faith. She had lived in Oakland, where she was connected to the Mount, Zion Spiritual Church, a congregation known for its blend of Christianity and African American spiritual traditions. She may have worked at an elementary school, and she was remembered by those who knew her as a woman with presence, strong, resilient, and deeply connected to her faith. The pendants found beside her body now carried new meaning. They weren't just random objects, they were pieces of her. Tokens of the life she lived, and perhaps symbols of the faith she carried with her until the very end. But while her name was returned, justice remains unfinished. Detectives have not yet identified who killed Vivian, or why she was targeted with such cruelty. The brutality of the stabbing, the dismemberment, the abandonment in a field, it all points to someone who knew her, or at the very least, someone determined to silence her completely. The case remains an open homicide investigation. For Vivian's family, the identification is bittersweet. They now know where she is, and they can finally say her name out loud without wondering if she is still out there. But the grief is doubled by time. They were denied answers for 44 years. Many of those who loved her have already passed, never knowing what became of her. And those still living must carry the realization that her killer may also still be alive, walking free. In announcing her identification, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office made a public appeal. They asked anyone with memories of Vivian, her church, her workplace, her neighborhood in Oakland, to come forward. Someone they believe knows more. Someone remembers. Vivian Moss's case is more than a murder. It is a reminder of how victims can be erased twice, first by the violence of their death, and then by decades of silence without a name. In restoring her identity, investigators gave her family a measure of truth, and they gave the community a chance to remember her not as an anonymous torso in a field, but as a woman of faith, family, and dignity. The case remains open. Justice has not yet arrived. But Vivian's story is no longer lost in the archives. Her name is spoken, her truth is restored, and for the first time in 44 years, the search for her killer begins again. Not for an unknown Jane Doe, but for the woman she always was, Vivian Moss.